Shalom Aleichem, my dear brothers and sisters. I was asked the question of whether Jews are allowed to live in the land of Israel before the Messiah comes. And I'm going to try to answer. This is a complex question, and I'm going to try to elaborate to the best of my ability. So in the Torah, we have 613 commandments. These are 613 biblical commandments. Commandment number 591, if you order them by numbers, so 591 is to appoint a king. So as Jews, we are obligated to appoint a king over ourselves. As the verse in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 15 says, "You shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses. From among your brothers you shall set a king over yourself. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother." End quote. So we have a clear commandment to set a king over ourselves. We have another commandment to build a temple. As the verse says, this commandment, by the way, is number 301, and the verse clearly says, "And they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst." So there's a commandment to build a sanctuary or a temple. Now, we have among the other commandments within the 613, we have several of them that are specifically tied into the land of Israel. So, for example, we have some commandments that are not tied into the land of Israel, like keeping the Sabbath or not charging interest. Doesn't matter where a Jew lives, whether he lives in Israel or in Australia or in Russia or in America, he has to observe the Sabbath and not charge interest to a fellow Jew. However, there are some commandments that are directly tied in to the land of Israel. These commandments are, for example, the law of Shemitah, which is the 7th year, meaning that we have to allow the land to rest on the 7th year, and not plant or gather the crops every 7th year. So this commandment is directly tied into the land of Israel, meaning while we are in the land of Israel, we have to observe this commandment there. If we live somewhere else, we do not have to observe this commandment. It's only tied into the land of Israel. So from here we see three different commandments. One is to appoint a king, another one is to build a temple, and the whole group of commandments that are directly tied into the land of Israel. And therefore it seems from here that there is an obligation to live in the land of Israel so that we can fulfill these commandments. That's what it seems like. Now, when Jews had a king, in times of David, peace be upon him, or Solomon, peace be upon him, that's how it was. There was a religious king, religious government, observed the commandments of the Torah, and obligated the Jews to observe the commandments of the Torah, keep the Shemitah year, and they had the temple, and everything was fine, and this is how it was. But then Jews began to sin, and eventually they started experiencing troubles. The enemy came in and exiled the Jews. So now, this was the situation we were faced with, that Jews were exiled. However, if you go to the original prophecies that we have in the books, the book of the Tanakh, what the Christians call the Old Testament, even though the Tanakh does not clearly speak about the Messiah himself, however, the Tanakh does speak clearly about the Messianic era, what's going to happen. When the Tanakh does mention the Messiah, sometimes it's not clear which Messiah it's talking about, because remember, in Hebrew, the word Mashiach simply means anointed. Back in the days, the way, what does it mean anointed? Back in the days, the way something gets anointed, you took olive oil specifically and you pour it on the person, or sometimes on an object, and this way the object or the person gets anointed. So the kings had to be anointed, the prophets had to be anointed, objects that stood in the temple had to be anointed, and the same root word is used, Mashiach, for all these things. Sometimes even the Tanakh calls a non-Jewish king, Cyrus, as the Mashiach, the anointed, because he was anointed. So therefore, if you look through the Tanakh, it's not so clear about the word Mashiach when it's used. However, what is clear is what's going to happen, the prophecies of the future, what we call the Messianic Era. And the prophecies are clear. there's a prophecy that says that the Jews are going to gather back to the land of Israel. That's one prophecy. There's a prophecy in book of Ezekiel that the third temple will be built. That's a prophecy. And there's a prophecy that eventually the kingdom of David will be reestablished. In fact, we see that God made a covenant with David, peace be upon him, King David. And it says in the book of Samuel, book number 2, chapter 7, verse 12 and 13, and this is God speaking to David through a prophet, and this is what God told him. It says, "When your days are finished, and you shall lie with your forefathers, then I will raise up your seed that shall proceed from your body after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So from here we see that God promised David that his descendant will have the throne forever. So this is also another messianic prophecy. Now, so therefore we have the messianic prophecies. And one of the greatest sages, the greatest scholars that probably ever lived among the Jews, his name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, sometimes called the Rambam. And he was probably the greatest, or at least one of the greatest scholars. And he writes in the Laws of the Kings, and he writes that, when it comes to the Messiah, there are two stages. And here's what he writes, I'm going to quote. "If a king arises from the house of David, who meditates on the Torah and occupies himself with the commandments like his ancestor David, in accordance with the written and oral Torah, and he will prevail upon all of Israel to walk in the ways of the Torah and to strengthen its breaches, and he will fight the battles of God, it may be assumed that he is the Mashiach." So in this statement, the Rambam writes that there are certain things, if he's trying to do, he's fighting certain battles for God, and he's trying to prevail upon the Jews to observe the commandments, and he's a king from the house of David specifically, then it may be assumed that he might be Mashiach. However, we're not sure yet, he only might be a Mashiach. However, then the Rambam writes, if he did these things successfully and defeated all the nations around him, built the sanctuary on its site, meaning in Jerusalem, and gathered the dispersed of Israel, he's definitely Mashiach. So then the Rambam writes basically is that as soon as he does these three things, fight certain battles for God, because one of the messianic prophecies is that the nations from the north are going to attack the land of Israel, and these nations are called, the nation is called Magog, or the place where Magog used to live. It's an ancient nation, and their leader is going to be Gog. That's one of the messianic prophecies. So anyway, so the Rambam writes that if he does these things, he successfully fights the wars for God, and he gathers the Jews to the land of Israel, because that's another messianic prophecy, and the third thing is that he builds the temple. If he does these things, then he is definitely Messiah. And what it means, is the way I understand, is that Messiah is not something that we passively wait for. Messiah will come passively. The way the Rambam seems to write is that the person can become a Messiah. If a person he's from the house of David, and we have such people, by the way, like this today, that have traced their lineage to the King David. I had a friend here in the United States who had a family tree going back all the way to the King of David, with the names of his father, grandfather, and going all the way to the King of David. And there's several, more than several families around the world that trace their lineage to the King David. And it's not that hard, because we know certain scholars that we had, for example, Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki lived around 1,000 years ago, and we have a family tree from him going to the King David, and therefore, if one can find the family tree from himself to this scholar, then it's easy to go back to the king. But anyways, so there are some people going back to that have lineage. So if that person is from the house of David, and he becomes a king, and he is able to do these three things that the prophecies tell us, then he can become the Messiah. Now, the Jewish concept of Messiah is actually a little bit different than what I think the most of the world believes. And from the Jewish perspective, it's interesting that if you look all throughout the 613 commandments that we have in the Torah, there's not one commandment that says, when the Messiah comes, you shall believe in him. There's no such commandment. We have a commandment to obey a king. So just like any king, we have a commandment to obey, just like we had a commandment to obey King David. The Torah commands us. We have a commandment to obey King Solomon, peace be upon them. We had a commandment to obey any of his sons that became kings. Same way, we have the commandment to obey the king, future king that's going to be from the house of David, whether he's Messiah or not. Therefore, whether he's going to fulfill these three things or not, we have an obligation to obey him. To believe he's the Messiah or not, it's not really, something that's really, fundamental in our religion. The prophecy merely tells us that eventually there will come a king who will do these things. But he was going to be a king, an ordinary king. In fact, the Rambam writes that Messiah is not going to perform miracles. We're not going to test him. We're not going to test him for any miracles. All he has to do is these three things, and therefore he's going to be the Messiah. And this is, by the way, probably the major reason why Jews did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. I'm not talking about accepting him as a son of God or as a prophet, but merely as a Messiah. Why did Jews not accept him? Because he did not fulfill these three things. First of all, he was not a king. To be a Messiah, you have to be anointed. You have to be anointed as a king. That's what, by definition, the way we understand the Messiah means. And that's first thing. And secondly, he has to do these three things that the Messianic era is supposed to bring. So therefore, that's why we did not, accept Jesus as the Messiah. But anyways, so therefore, from the Jewish perspective, the Messiah is somebody that's gonna, be able to do these things, and he's gonna be declared. He's gonna be not even declared. He's gonna be what the prophecies talked about when they said the Messiah eventually will come and do these, fulfill these things. Now back to the original question of whether Jews can live in the land of Israel before the Messiah. So there is a passage in the Talmud which says that Jews gave 3 oaths to God, and one of them was not to rebel against the nations to which they are exiled, and then another one is, then there's another one, and the last one is that they will not grab the land of Israel by force, and the Talmud means before the Messiah, Messianic era. Now, this is where the argument comes in. There's the group like the Naturi Karta, which I'm sure you guys have heard, where they say, the Messianic era or the Messiah has not come yet, and therefore we have no right to grab the land of Israel, and therefore Jews have no right to at least have power in the land of Israel. They're not talking about living in the land of Israel because that's something else. But I think they're talking about grabbing power. That's one side of the debate. And then there is another side that says that when it comes to the Messiah, it's something, we're actively trying to bring. And therefore, how can a king be in Israel that's going to follow the laws of the Torah and build the temple and do all these things? Only because, according to the Rambam, only then he becomes the Messiah. After he does these 3 things, gathers the Jews, builds the temple, only after that he becomes the Messiah. This is the prerequisite of becoming a Messiah. So the other side of the debate can say that in order for the Messiah to come, these 3 things have to happen first. That's what's going to make him a Messiah. So there's this side of the debate, and there's actually a third side which says that what the Talmud says, that the Jews themselves will not grab power by force, but if the state will be established by other nations. And what they say is that the UN is gonna, has declared the state of Israel as an independent state, and therefore other nations are allowed to do it, but Jews are not allowed to do it, to declare it themselves without any permission from the other nations. So that's the third. Now, I'm not gonna tell you which, politically which opinion is the correct one. That's not my purpose. I'm just stating you the different sides of the debate when it comes to these things, and I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of what the Jewish concept of Messiah is. And thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please comment, and I will do my best to explain. Thank you.